Okay, I believe we're on time now. Let's get started.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Good morning for those of you who are following us from California, Berkeley community, Professor Jafek. It's wonderful to have you with us today. My name is Renan Braz, or Renan Braz here in the US. I'm a partner lawyer at the Torreon Braz Advogados law firm, University of California, Berkeley alumni. My colleague Ronald Barbosa will bring us detailed information about our panelists in a while, but on behalf of Torreon Braz Advogados law firm, I'd like to welcome and thank Ms. Valerie Belon. She's the economic counselor at the US Embassy in Brasilia. Deputy Jair, thanks for joining us as well. And Ms. Laura Rabinowitz, shareholder in the Greenberg Traurig law firm. Thank you for joining us and welcome. Extending also our special thanks to both the US Department of State and to the Greenberg Traurig firm as well for partnering with us on this webinar. Welcome to our guest listeners as well. We have guests from Brazil, from the US, all of those interested in the relations between the US and Brazil on foreign trade commerce matters are welcome and should find value on the ideas that we're about to discuss. Finally, thanks Ronald Barbosa and the Machado Gobo Advogados law firm for moderating the webinar with me and sharing the screen. It's a pleasure. And I'll let you bring to our guest listeners some additional information now.
I would like to thank you, Renan Torreon. I would also like to welcome all of you on behalf of Machado Gobo Advogados, who has a partnership with Torreon Braz Advogados. The United States and Brazil have a long and prosperous relationship. In this sense, Counselor Valerie Belon and Mrs. Laura Rabinowitz, it's an honor to have you here with us today. I especially would like to welcome all the Americans and Brazilian companies which are watching this webinar. For those who are here with us for the first time, it's important to explain how it works. We will have two panelists who are going to address an opening speech. After that, we will have a specific time dedicated to questions. The first speech will be addressed by Counselor Valerie Belon, who served over more than 25 years with the Department of State. She was a deputy chief of mission on the US Embassy in the Suriname, South America. After that, she became economic counselor in US Embassy in Brasilia. She has an MBA in Princeton University and Master of Art in International Policy Studies in Stanford University. The second speech will be addressed by Mrs. Laura Rabinowitz, shareholder of the Greenberg Traurig. Mrs. Rabinowitz served as an attorney with U.S. Customs Office of the Assistant Chief Counsel, representing customs and litigation in the Court of International Trade. She was special counsel at Kelly Dry & Warren, and Laura has joined the New York office of global law firm Greenberg Traurig as a shareholder in its international trade practice. Mrs. Rabinowitz received her GDA from Benjamin Cardozo School of Law and her BA from the University of Pennsylvania. So for the opening speech, I'd like to invite Counselor Valerie Belon. Thank you very much, all of you. Oh, I forgot, you are very welcome, Jay. Deputy Jay, you are very welcome. And now I'd like to invite the Counselor Valerie Belon to make the opening speech. Thank you very much for all of you.
Great. Thank you very much, Ronald. I really appreciate the introduction. You mentioned a little bit about my background, and I want to touch on that for a second just to make a point. I was an economics major at Princeton University. I actually graduated the same year as Jeff Bezos, but that's a whole nother story. I also have an MBA from UCLA, and yes, I did go to Stanford as well for a master's program. Before I came to Brasilia, I spent 2 years actually teaching economics at the graduate level at National Defense University immediately prior to coming here. But if I hadn't been an econ major, I think, if I were reincarnated and got to try something else, I would definitely want to be a history major. We are living in unprecedented times. And I think the historians looking back on this will have kind of a wealth of research material. So I'm passionate about history and the lessons that we can draw from it. So here, not only what we're going through with coronavirus, but this huge opportunity we have on economic and trade policy, the approach between the U.S. and Brazil, very like-minded at this moment. So what we're going to do with that is an open question, and we're trying to seize that opportunity. So yes, these are unprecedented historic times. And because of that, the US Embassy, our new ambassador, and I fully agree, our priorities 1, 2, and 3 are all coronavirus. We really need to partner with Brazil to fight the coronavirus on multiple levels, in multiple ways. Everything we got to throw at it, because this is, a vicious enemy. So, we're looking after our people, we're looking after American citizens, we're partnering with Brazil to, look at vaccine development, to bring in respirators. There's a shipment of respirators coming as a donation from the government of the United States to Brazil later this week. The first 200 of 1,000 respirators we're donating. But all that being said, that is extremely important, of course, but our work on economic and trade policy is not paused because of that. Quite the contrary, quite the opposite. Now more than ever, we are focusing on our common interests in economic policy reforms, we hope to double trade between the United States within the next 5 years. Ambassador said it many times. I think that's achievable. And investment opportunities, because we really need to build a catapult to come out of this on the other side. And unfortunately, the perception in the international press is that, the policymakers in the Brazil's executive and legislative branches are not interested in pursuing economic reforms right now, that they are taking a pause. And we're just not finding that to be true. The ambassador's recent meetings at very high levels, in both the executive and legislative, based on our discussions, that's just flat out wrong, that they're very interested in reform for the reason I've just stated. We need to set Brazil up for success. We're hearing that they, in contrast, that they want to design reforms and adopt best practices to build this catapult back for an economic comeback after the worst of the coronavirus is over. So the assistance I mentioned that the US is providing to Brazil, just very briefly, $12.5 million in government to government assistance, including from the CDC, from USAID, from the State Department. But that really dwarfs in comparison to the assistance that the private sector, what the private sector is investing in this fight. And we've calculated, and I'm sure we've missed a lot, $42 million that the US companies in Brazil, and mind you, there's 400 out of the Fortune 500 are here. So there's a lot of companies doing a lot of great work. So this is a historic moment, a unique window of opportunity, especially given Brazil's clear preference for a closer relation with the US and the close personal connection between our two presidents. And not to mention the support from all the major Brazilian stakeholders, business and trade associations, exporters, CNI, and especially for progress on non-tariff barriers. So trade is an important element of what we're trying to do. As I said, 400 of the Fortune 500 are already here. There are many investors wanting to invest in Brazil. I mean, after all, it's the 8th largest economy. How can you not want access to over 210 million consumers? Of course, they want to invest in Brazil. But this number keeps coming up over and over again. This number 124. This number 124 is Brazil's rank on the World Bank's Ease of Doing Business Index. 124th. Shouldn't be 124th. It should be 8th. It's the 8th largest economy. It should be, even Paulo Guedes himself has said he wants to get it in the top 50. And I know that his people are working very hard. So now is, the moment, well, I'll say on trade, okay. Now the moment is not ripe to open formal, comprehensive free trade agreement negotiations. Our US trade representative said recently, no, we're not negotiating free trade agreement with Brazil right now. I think it's a medium-term goal. It's not even a long-term goal, it's a medium-term goal, but I just don't see it as a short-term goal for 3 reasons. One, you have the Mercosur question. Okay, how can you negotiate bilaterally with a member of Mercosur? And Brazil has talked about maybe redefining its relationship with Brazil or redefining Mercosur. I mean, redefining its relationship with Mercosur or just redefining Mercosur. But that hasn't, we're not there yet. So the Mercosur question, automatically pops up when you talk about comprehensive free trade agreement that gets into tariffs. Second reason, US elections, this is we're only 5.5 months away or so, highly politicized period. In our system, the US Congress plays a very important role, not just in ratifying a trade agreement, but from day one, our US trade representative is required by law to consult with stakeholders, US business, Congress. There's a formal notification process, but I think it's really more than that. It's, an effort to include, and I've seen members of Congress, in the delegation for formal negotiations. So they have to be part of this, and, and this far into an election year, it just doesn't really make sense. And then the third reason is, I think the most compelling, is that there are plenty other things to discuss. And so we're discussing those plenty of other things. So trade facilitation and, working for a mutual recognition agreement on authorized economic operators. We call this shorthand in the US, trusted trader. Good regulatory practices, digital trade, including, let's talk about digital taxes on digital products. This is an ongoing discussion at the OECD. OECD has all sorts of best practices, guidance on all of the trade facilitation, on digital trade, on good regulatory practices. And then the fourth area is anti-corruption. So we've introduced that as a topic of discussion for these trade discussions that are going on between USTR and their counterparts, which is both Itamaraty and the Minister Economia. So, trade facilitation, non-tariff barriers, technical barriers to trade, good regulatory practices, new areas covered in our most modern trade agreements. If you look at the USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, if you look at the Japan agreement, if you look at the China Phase 1 agreement, there's a lot of stuff in there that wasn't in trade agreements that we did 10, 15 years ago. So all this new things that are talking about digital trade, talking about intellectual property, talking about things that have evolved in this new world where services are as, if not more important than goods trade, traditional trade. You can't just think of containers full of products. That's a very limited view of trade. And even if you do, trade facilitation is often more important than tariffs, because tariffs on average are quite low around the world. So I get, just to close out, to reiterate, there's plenty to discuss. USTR has the lead. Now more than ever, it's critical to do the preparatory work to lay the groundwork for reforms to make the 8th, or at least in the top 50 in the World Bank Index for ease of doing business. So let's work together to help them jumpstart reforms, to look at economic and trade policy, really to set the stage for a rebound. Because my daughter is taking a history course this summer, and her first unit is on the Great Depression. I really envy her, actually, and I read some of her materials last night because it's fascinating. The debate now isn't really whether it's going to be a V. The debate now among economists anyway is whether it's going to be U or an L or the slope of the L. Getting out of this, it's not going to be easy or quick, unfortunately, but we can do our best to lay the groundwork to make it as easy and quick as possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chancellor, for your speech. They are very important points, and I think it will be very important for our discussion. And I'd like to invite Mrs. Rabinowitz, the shareholder of Greenberg Traurig, to make her speech too. Welcome. Welcome. Yeah. You have your time. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Valerie. That was very, very interesting. I mean, your perspective is really on the ground and with the trade team. So it was very interesting. Thank you. So I'll talk quickly about sourcing globally and sourcing in the age of the pandemic. I mean, for multinational companies who source raw materials and components globally in multiple countries, they manufacture in multiple countries, import and export globally. I mean, the pandemic has created just such enormous supply chain difficulties. That's an understatement. I mean, starting in the beginning of March, the question was, can raw materials get from, where they are to the factories for manufacture? Could Italian fabric get to the Chinese factories? And then that quickly changed to, oh, now the Chinese factories are closed, and then the Italian factories were closed. So, by the middle of March, there were just massive cancellations of orders. From a US perspective, US buyers, wholesale, retail were just canceling orders tremendously. And so, I mean, the pandemic just wreaked havoc with global supply chains. I mean, just cannot understate that enough. And then as the pandemic progressed, supply and demand changed. So I have, there were many factories were closed globally, and food factories were working 24-hour shifts. I work with a company that manufactures plastic packaging for the cosmetics industry, and they switched to manufacture plastic face masks for hospital workers. So supply and demand changed, and companies were evolving. From a U.S. customs perspective, the ports stayed open. There were not increased detentions, so at least that was a good thing. And I know for the Brazilian companies I work with, the experience was very similar for the multinationals. Whether they're sourcing globally or manufacturing in Brazil, exporting to the U.S., they had the same challenges of lockdown, factories being closed, purchase orders being canceled. And now we're seeing factories starting to reopen, companies going back to work. And of course, there's the added layer of, making everything safe for workers. As Valerie said, it's, priorities are pandemic. So that is certainly true for global supply chains. So I would say, the pandemic has happened, with a backdrop of current U.S. trade policy. This administration has been very aggressive in the use of tariffs as a negotiating tool. The USTR has stated the administration has a goal of bringing manufacturing back to the United States. Pre-pandemic, this administration instituted additional tariffs on aluminum and steel, which impacted Brazil, on products from China and the EU. And that, of course, is on top of the general rate of duty. Just from products from China, there's an additional tariffs of about 50 billion has been collected by the US. So it started with the US using the president using Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which gives the executive authority to impose tariffs that are deemed threatening to national security. So it's a little used provision, but this administration has used it. The Commerce Department did a review, and then the Trump administration imposed tariffs on aluminum and steel in March of 2018. Brazil, then each country negotiated their own, deal, whether it was tariffs or a combination of tariffs and quota, and Brazil had quota. And then finally in December, as you know, December of 2019, the president announced that there would not be additional tariffs on Brazilian steel and aluminum. So that was a good thing. In terms of China, as I said, the US has imposed under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, the US has imposed 25% additional duties on 250 billion of Chinese merchandise imported into the US, and then a fourth tranche of 116 billion in September of 2019, and that's at 7.5% additional duty. It started as a response to China's IP regulations and forced technology transfer requirements, and the Trump administration broadened that discussion to include agricultural products, currency manipulation, and cyber theft. So I think that does speak to, as Valerie mentioned, as new free trade agreements are negotiated, they're going to include these additional issues which were not there before. There was no cyberspace when the original NAFTA was negotiated, for example. So importers of, US importers of components and products from China have been dealing with 25% additional duty since July of 2018 and using, any mitigation possible. And there were Brazilian multinational companies that are severely impacted by that. And then, of course, there's also the Trump administration added tariffs on products from the EU. This is from a long-standing dispute in the WTO over subsidies to Airbus. It's 25% additional duty on EU products and 15% on aircraft. And these are very country-specific and product-specific. Cheese and fruit, meat, Irish and Scotch whiskey, all the good things that the US imports from Europe. So that's the backdrop. And now we have the intersection of the pandemic and current US trade policy. This administration, as I said, has made it a priority of the importance of bringing manufacturing back to the US. They view it as the US has a strategic vulnerability. That in particular, certain products are not manufactured here, particularly medical equipment. And we can see also, interestingly, as the pandemic continues, there's now bipartisan support for the idea of reshoring of supply chains in the US. I find that, sort of very, very interesting. So specifically in terms of the US and Brazil, I would say the relationship has evolved. It seemed in March that the president, had directed the US Trade Representative Lighthizer to deepen the relationship. As Valerie mentioned, both countries have been working on specific issues, which I think is a good thing, good regulatory practices, anti-corruption, trade facilitation. I think that's very, very promising. And then this past week, Lighthizer, the US Trade Representative, testified before Congress and said, clearly the US is not negotiating, adamantly, the US is not negotiating a free trade agreement. So that was anyone who thought that this was going to become a free trade agreement, he made that very clear. We're not negotiating a free trade agreement. And interestingly, the Democrats in Congress supported that notion and said that the US should not move forward with the free trade agreement with Brazil and with the current administration. And you just, I'm thinking, as Valerie was talking, I read, quotes from the transcript and the press. So I don't know the backstory to his testimony, but at least, that's reported. So, and I think Lighthizer, at least, from what I read, seemed very clear that the US priority was to open Brazil up for the US to increase US jobs. So in any case, as the Trump administration continues with additional tariffs on additional products, they seem to like this. The digital services tax, which will, potentially impact Brazil. The US has named 10 countries, Brazil being one of them, Austria, Czech Republic, the EU, UK, India, but Brazil is on the list. So we'll see what happens there. And then the Trump administration is investigating other products to add additional tariffs. The metal, vanadium, transformers and components of transformers, which will impact the energy industry. So, this administration has been clear in its use of using trade policy as a negotiating tool, and I think they'll continue to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Rabinowitz. I think it was really enlightening. We have a few topics here. I think we can address some interesting matters on this topic, and then we can see if we can get a conversation going. First, I was curious. Miss Belon said that.
Hannah, just a second. I saw that Councillor Valerie was taking some notes. Do you want to make? Yeah,
that's okay.
Yes, I didn't know if you want to make.
It was I always take notes.
All right, no, thank you very much. So Hannah, I'm sorry.
It was very good.
To make any response. So Hannah, I'm sorry. You can go on.
All right, perfect. So Madam Councillor mentioned OECD. Now, just as a broad question, how do you see the perspective of Brazil in joining the OECD in the future, and what do you think might be the impacts in case it happens?
So Brazil, I guess it began maybe almost 3 years ago that Brazil has been pushing very hard to start the accession process. Unfortunately, the accession process really has been stalled or the enlargement question has been stalled for more than 3 years. So, and I don't see movement on that because the Europeans have really not changed their position. The US has changed our position to try and find a way forward, but that hasn't resulted in any change in the European position. So, but I think it's important to recognize that Brazil, more than any other candidate country, is ready to start the accession process. And the US position as of, when did we, I think January, we came out with our new position, which very strongly supporting Brazil. And if the facts lead you there very quickly. Brazil has adhered to at least, I haven't updated this number in a long time, but at least 82 OECD instruments. Over 60 are under review, meaning I think Brazil probably has done everything necessary to adhere, but the OECD staff then reviews, are they in alignment with OECD? So let's say easily over 100. They're participating actively in many committees, in many discussions, everything from environment, anti-corruption, digital tax. The OECD is a great place and resource for best practices. If you are able to model your reforms at least to some degree, if not entirely, on OECD best practices and norms, you're gonna, your economy is gonna benefit with greater productivity, greater growth, you know, a stronger comeback to the economic impacts of the pandemic, you know, and so you don't even have to go to the difficult enlargement and accession discussion. Just doing what they're doing is good for Brazil, period, full stop. So I admire Brazil for doing all this really difficult work. I mean, a lot of times it requires very detailed work on things from transfer pricing or dispute resolution, you know, very complex, difficult topics, requires accountants and lawyers and, you know, the people really down in the weeds to map out a transition plan to get Brazil from being this outlier. There's a word in Portuguese, jacabutim, is it? Or just there's that, you know, Brazil does things its own way, unlike any other country, and to, you know, more along the norms of developed countries. So I think for OECD, I can hope that this enlargement question will eventually be resolved, but it's going to take some fresh thinking and fresh leadership at the OECD. The current head of the OECD, the Secretary General, I think his mandate runs out in less than a year. So that might be, hopefully there'll be a sooner opportunity for fresh leadership and fresh thinking, but I think it's all good in the meantime that Brazil is very focused on adhering, aligning, you know, getting within these OECD norms and best practices.
Yeah, I think it's, you know, once the hard work is being done beforehand, then it's easier to talk about it in the future. And especially in the post-pandemic scenario, I think it should be a stronger goal, or maybe something that should be discussed better in the future.
And when I first came here 2 years ago, one of my answers on OECD was, well, you know, what I'm hearing is that the accession process for Colombia was really messy, really painful. They don't want to repeat that. And Brazil is setting itself up to be quite the opposite, because the more ready you are before you even start the accession process, the less painful and messy it will be. So. Yes,
perfect. Now, Ms. Rabinowitz, if you have any topic or question related to what we're discussing, feel free to jump in and bring it, and we can.
Yeah, thank you. I'd like, as I said, since Valerie's on the ground there, I'd like to know if you could speak a bit about the progress you think, you know, in terms of the trade negotiations on these specific topics between now and the end of December. You know, where do you think we'll be?
Well, I am quite optimistic that at least a couple of these 4 areas that they're currently talking about will be ripe for concluding, let's say, a mini deal before the end of the year. Certainly one, they're on trade facilitation, they're very, very close. I'm not, you know, myself participating in the negotiations, so I can't say firsthand knowledge, but everything I'm hearing is, oh yeah, just a few more things to wrap up. But I think the good regulatory practices, probably not so far. Yeah, the others, I mean, everything's on the table and they're working. You know, one interesting observation I have from on the ground is when I first arrived, it was just before the elections here, and there hadn't been an ATEC meeting. ATEC is the forum in which these discussions are happening. Agreement on Trade and Economic Cooperation, I think it's called. But there hadn't been an ATEC meeting in over 2 years. And And so, you know, with the new government, it was clear they wanted to revive this, and sure enough, it did get revived. I think it took a little while to get it going, but in August, I think, was the first ATEC meeting after this long pause. And so things were very kind of methodical and regular meetings. I think, you know, monthly or every 6 weeks, they were doing a lot by video conferencing, because USTR was bringing in a lot of different experts in different areas. But then since January, I have to say, I have noticed the pace very different. It's like 3 times as fast, many, many more meetings, a lot more, you know, getting detailed issues resolved and moving forward. So I think the momentum of the president's meeting certainly helped, but you know, I think both sides got marching orders from above. You know, let's pick up the pace and get this done this year.
Good, thank you. That's good to know. That's not exactly what you read in the press, so.
No. Yeah.
Hannah?
Yeah, well, you know, we've read in the press also that both American and Brazilian corporations, you know, they've been urging their governments to not, if not sign an agreement, but just to bring closer regulations and practices, you know, and to make it easier, the trade, commerce, and investment between the countries, as it would be an interesting means of, you know, helping with the economic crisis and overcoming it. Do you think that some matters such as intellectual property, regulatory topics, e-commerce, do you think that that's been it's a potential measure to be addressed now, as the companies themselves they've been asking for topics such as this one, IP, you know, tech companies, and regulatory topics, of course, sanitary, phytosanitary.
Is that a question for me or for Laura?
For you.
Oh.
I'm sorry, for you.
Okay. Well, I noticed that one of the questions that you all had and kind of beforehand ideas of questions was, what areas would I like to see more focus on? And actually, intellectual property. I mean, we are having good discussions on intellectual property, but they're very working level for the most part, but then gets high level attention when the annual 301, special 301 process happens. But I'd like to see more throughout the year focus on IP issues, because there's still a lot of work to be done. I think that the patent backlog has improved from, I think it was at its worst, it was 9 years. Now it's maybe 6, but we want to get it down to no more than 3 years, you know, maybe 60,000 applications. There's a lot of IP treaties that Brazil could adopt. I think the most important one perhaps being the WIPO copyright treaty, but also the WIPO performances and phonograms treaty, the Hague Agreement, the Singapore Treaty on the law of trademarks, the Budapest Treaty. But, you know, more than just treaties, we want to see Brazil adapt its or modernize, adapt its laws. For instance, you know, I'll give some concrete examples. Increase the penalties for those caught dealing in counterfeit products. It should at least match those associated with copyright violations. And also criminalize signal theft. And Receita Federal really should be authorized and encouraged to share importer information with brand owners. And the government of Brazil should take steps to convert all industrial and intellectual property crimes to unconditional public crimes or offenses, which would give prosecutors more discretion to take cases that they deem worthwhile, and also signal that the crimes are not second-class crimes. So, I mean, there's still a lot to be done on intellectual property, and I think that's an area that the U.S. is has always focused, in my career, has always focused a lot of attention to, but the more kind of tech dependent we are becoming, and content and tech, the more important, they've only increased in importance. So we've got to get the IP regime right, or else, you know, a lot of things just don't make business sense.
Yeah, I think we've seen progress in this area. You know, Brazil joined an international agreement in trademark registration that I believe is effective in 120 countries. So it simplifies the process. Recently, data protection law has been enacted. Also, it's close to being in effect. It's not yet, but it's close. So I think this is a very important matter to be addressed. And you know, Brazil is also having a startup environment and interesting growth in this environment. And you know, the tech industry is always each time closer to different goods and services. You know, and they're building innovation in every industry. So yeah, it's really important. Ronald, if you wanna jump in and ask any questions, feel free. Otherwise,
I actually,
no, Laura, you first. I can make my question after you. No problem.
No, I wanted to, because you asked Valerie about you know, sort of specific issues as we move forward.
All right.
What about labor provisions? We saw in USMCA. I mean, that's one of the biggest changes between NAFTA and USMCA, or the additional labor provisions. Do you think that would also be something between the US and Brazil?
I mean, we do talk regularly about labor issues, just how our embassy is organized. That's handled by a different office, so I don't follow it as closely as I do other issue areas. But yeah, of course, labor issues are going to be important, and they're going to be important to our members of Congress in order to get any agreement ratified. So yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just to complement, in Brazil also we saw changes in the labor field, and even before the coronavirus, but nowadays it's also a very hot topic here, labor law, but it's also very active. Yeah.
All right, thank you very much. I have a specific topic here, and it's about the global value chains. I think I would like to hear from both of you, the counselor and Mrs. Rabinowitz, because some believe that Brazil finds difficult to participate in global value chains, which is the interaction between countries and production of goods and service and its supply, distribution, and post-sale activity. Whether due to barriers related to accessing technologies, knowledge, or attracting direct investments to applying value chains, export matters, taxation over direct investments abroad. In any case, it's now that Brazil and the US have successful examples of global value chains, such as the commerce of iron ore and steel, by which Brazil processes raw material provided by the US, and then the final good is commercialized back to the US. Another example is brought by the Brazilian company Embraer, which is in Florida, that builds regional passenger aircraft under a similar model to acquire aluminum. For the coming years, do you believe that there are ways we can expand successful models of global value chains between Brazil and the United States to other industries?
Laura, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'll start. Yes, I think Embraer and commodities are an terrific example of global supply chains that work for all companies involved in that global supply chain. And I think that's what the US is interested in. I mean, the auto industry, for example, the auto industry is very important to the US. And I've seen it with Korean companies, Japanese companies, where they take advantage of that, manufacturing globally and servicing the US auto industry. And then, the autos, are made here, whether it's, a motor to move a seat, but but that manufacturing is done in the US. The motor is imported, and then the seat is manufactured in the US, and the auto is manufactured in the US. So sort of a win-win for everybody. So yes, I definitely think, you know, particularly where, you know, where Brazil excels in certain commodities and other components, but yes.
Nice. Councillor?
I'm going to kind of defer to my the Deputy Economic Counselor at the U.S. Embassy. Jay Nair is here with us, so give him a chance to answer that.
Sure, thank you. And as you've mentioned, there are some really good examples of integrated supply chains that are very beneficial for both the U.S. and the Brazilian partners. In terms of what we can do to promote more of those examples, I think we've already touched on some of the keys. One of those is, for example, Brazil's perception in the doing business surveys, the understanding of the Custo Brasil. And I think the commitment of the government of Brazil to try to address some of the systemic areas that need to be improved to improve the rankings on the doing business is really going to change the perception that countries have of the ability to either invest directly or how easily they will find it to do business with a Brazilian partner to integrate them into their supply chain. So I'd say there's a kind of the Custo Brasil side of it, and which on the policy side, which has to do with the taxes and the forms and the ease of import and export. And one of the areas that, as we mentioned, trade facilitation is one of the areas in which we're discussing being able to formalize an agreement on that. The other half of that is not on the policy side, but is just on the actual costs of the logistics process through the airports, the ports, the road transportation system. And those are areas where we're also trying to incentivize improvements in those sectors, including through some partnerships that we have at the government level. The Treasury Department, the Commerce Department of the United States have agreements with their Brazilian counterparts to work on identifying some of the areas where policy changes could improve the environment for investment from abroad, including, obviously, we'd like to see American investors participating here in ways that could reduce the costs of the logistics side of doing business between the United States and Brazil. And our Treasury Department, along with the rest of the U.S. government, has launched an initiative called the Growth in the Americas Initiative, or America Cresce in the Portuguese version. But we're looking to work with partners throughout Latin America and South America to try to make it easier for people to invest in both directions and build those supply chains, particularly in the key underlying sectors that make the business happen. So the infrastructure and the energy sectors, to try to identify the policy obstacles and see if there are ways that we can provide assistance, expertise, guidance on making the policy changes, the regulatory changes that will make the environment more attractive to U.S. and other market-oriented foreign investors, which I think, as I said, once you kind of address those enabling sectors, then Brazil, as there's increased confidence by other parts of the global supply chain that they'll be able to do the business that they're hoping to, that it'll go out the way that the business transactions will be performed in the way they were expected to, without impediments, without obstacles, then Brazil's advantages in terms of distance, in terms of natural resources, will help motivate an increased integration into those supply chains.
I just wanted to mention, since you mentioned about logistics, for U.S. companies that are exporting to Brazil, in my experience, the customs regime is very, I don't want to say, I'll just say complicated. I mean, I work with companies that import and export globally, and Brazil's is probably the most difficult to navigate for U.S. companies. So that would be my suggestion to increase trade facilitation, would be to somehow streamline it, make it easier. Yeah.
That's something we hear from a lot of American companies. On the facilitation side, one of the areas that's been improved is the single window for Brazilian exporters, and that's a process that should be, in theory, there's a roadmap to extend that for the importation process as well. And from the experiences that we've heard from companies involved, it's made a big difference for the export side. So if that could be replicated on the import side, that would go a long way towards simplifying the process. But then there's also regulatory changes, regulatory measures behind that in terms of simplifying, in terms of the types of inspections or pre-import licenses that might need to be done. That there could be some simplification work on that side as well.
Yeah, and some streamlining between ports.
Correct.
Yeah, we
Great,
got a
thank you.
red flag, red flag to write down here. Great. Now, Madam Councillor, now just broadly speaking, do you think that the devaluation of the Brazilian currency impact the foreign trade? I mean, corporations usually have means to protect themselves from such, so changes in short term and long term. But do you think it's a matter that they are following closely, and it's maybe relevant, especially in the short term?
Well, I think the loss of value of the Brazilian real relative to the dollar has been great for Brazilian exporters. I think the agriculture sector in particular is booming, in part because of that. It's also great for the auctions they have planned coming up, the concessions, the privatizations at the federal, state, and city level. It's a good deal. I mean, it's if you're buying and using dollars, something that's priced in real, it's now's the time. So I mean, they still need to get their investment climate in order, but when you're just kind of doing the cost benefit analysis as a U.S. investor, that a weak real makes it a lot more attractive. So I think, yeah, in the short term and potentially in the medium term, as long as the real stays as weak as it is, it's good for Brazil. People that don't follow Brazil closely might wrongly jump to wondering whether there's some manipulation going on because of this, but I do not see any evidence of that. In fact, the Brazil Central Bank has intervened to keep the Brazil up when it has intervened. So I think it might hurt some businesses that are importing key components, which become more expensive if they're priced in dollars. But overall, I think it's an opportunity for exporters to really expand their markets.
Great. I'm shifting gears a little bit here. I heard that Mercosur is one of the first reasons. It's the first reason why it's hard to reach an agreement or to have foreign trade matters being addressed, especially tariff matters, because of restrictions from Mercosur, the Southern Common Market. Now, in Brazil there is we call ex-tarifário, which is a regimen that allows the importing tax rate to be dropped from usually 14-16% to 2% nowadays, even 0% during COVID times. And it's a temporary reduction, so it's usually for 2 years. And it's interesting because it's a matter of attracting investments and exempt investments, and it's usually directed to productive enterprises when they bring some goods or special capital goods or IT goods that are not produced in Brazil. So if there is not production in Brazil, it's an important or an interesting way of attracting investment that comes from the Mercosur. Now, I was wondering, do you believe that American companies, do they know about this regimen, this benefit, or is it sought by American corporations as an important matter when they are assessing if they're expanding activities to Brazil or just partnering with Brazil? Do you know if it's something that they have as a lookout?
Yes, and thank you for the question, Hannah, because I was a little afraid here because of the time, and I thought it's a very important topic to talk about ex-tarifario because we have the Southern Common Market and all the taxes, and then I really would like to hear from you, Counselor, how the American companies know, if they know the process, because it's a very complicated process to do here in Brazil. So how can they use this ex-tarifario and do this, the foreign trade?
I think it's a great policy. And, if you want your businesses to grow and expand and invest, the smart thing to do is to reduce tariffs in these areas, capital goods in particular, but also ICT, modernize, increase productivity. It's very smart. I think Laura might be better positioned to say how familiar U.S. companies are with this and navigating the process. Yeah, I have heard some feedback that some companies don't make use of it because it is kind of complicated, but I don't know, Laura, what have you heard?
Yeah, that's my experience. It's not widely used because it's complicated.
Yeah, which is a shame.
Laura, just for my curiosity, what are the complicated point? What's complicating the process? They don't know how it works here in COMEX, or they don't just find very complicated.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the size of the U.S. company. They really need more, boots on the ground in Brazil to explain it, So I think that's the issue is, I mean, I worked with, it's quite a large U.S. apparel company with, many retail operations in the U.S. and they were opening up retail stores in Brazil. And it was too much. Like they were just starting. But I think as, the more time companies are in Brazil, I think they take advantage, a little bit more. But it's complicated. Yeah, they really needed tax advice.
Yeah. Now, as one of, I mean, I was curious here also. Do you think there is any, you mentioned other countries and the relations between U.S. and China and other countries. Do you think is there any country-specific relation or country or agreement that maybe Brazil can look up to? Like it was maybe an interesting experience from the U.S. side, and we can look up to and maybe learn something.
Yeah, I mean, particularly this administration likes, well, though, except for USMCA, which is 3 parties, but they like bilateral agreements. I mean, the Korea FTA, which was negotiated before the Trump administration, but I like that free trade agreement because it really benefits both countries. And I think as Brazil and the U.S. negotiate more, I think that's the focus. I mean, as Lighthizer said, he wants more U.S. jobs. I mean, we're in a difficult economic time. So I think it really has to be beneficial. It's not like AGOA, which is really just beneficial to the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, which are a party to it, which is worthwhile in and of itself. But I think, like Korea with the auto industry, I think that's the.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I'm a little afraid about the time, and we have a rule here in the law firm that we do respect the time of people. So we reached an hour. It has been a pleasure talking to you, and I'd like to open you if I have any final consideration, so that we can finish this.
If I may, Ronald, just to share, my perspective is that I think that as we've been discussing here in Brazil, we've seen a lot happening. So legislative changes and trademark, data protection, labor law, civil law has been changing also in the section that deals with contract law, business law matters. I think on the judiciary side, in the superior and Supreme Courts in Brazil, we have important cases that are waiting for judgment, but these are cases that are going to set the interpretation, the application of the law countrywide. So I think that we expect to have more foreseeability of the law that is going to be applied in Brazil. And also courts in various states, they're separating specialized judges to deal with business and corporate matters as bankruptcy law, for instance. So as a sum, I think that in Brazil, there's a lot to be done, yes, but there's a lot being ongoing in an ongoing process. You know, we are going forward to having more certainty in the application of the law, the business and corporate law in Brazil. So businesses, therefore, they can reduce costs because if they can put this in their favor if they know how specific situations are going to be dealt in the country. So simplify operations and reducing costs for stability. And, you know, it's a country that has millions of users of the internet and consumers. So it's a very, like Madam Councillor said, it's a huge country, should be a huge economy, and it should reflect in trade as such an important relations with the US should be an example. And you know what I saw as a current example was WhatsApp. WhatsApp, under the Facebook umbrella, just launched a feature that enables digital payments in Brazil. The reason for that being Brazil is the second largest market of customers of the WhatsApp app, and the first one is India, but due to a maze of regulations in India, they couldn't apply it first in India and then here. So and India was actually the country where they were testing the beta application of this feature, the beta version of the feature, and so they decided to do it there in Brazil actually. And you know, Facebook group is a big player, of course, and it must be taken into consideration, but it's interesting to see that there has been activity going on, and even during coronavirus times. So yeah, I expect some great developments for the future.
Very nice.
Ronald, yeah, I have a final comment. I would say for companies that are importing into the US, the biggest challenge right now is trying to move a part or all of their supply chain out of China. I mean, moving a complete supply chain out of China is very difficult, but certainly if certain components or raw materials, certain production steps can be moved out of China, that's what this administration wants to see. And I think whoever's in the White House will continue to want to see that as well. So moving to the US would be, the A, but just below that is just moving out of China. And I think Brazil has a huge advantage by being close to the United States. Shipment times are much shorter, and it's a tremendous workforce. So I think there's great potential there for Brazil during this time.
Yeah, I mean, it's all about the pandemic right now. None of us are doctors or nurses or vaccine researchers. So I think our contribution is laying the groundwork for an economic rebound, and trade is going to be a very important part of that. And getting the supply chains right is going to be a very important part of that. Brazil improving its ease of doing business is going to be a critically important part of that. So there's plenty to do. The fact that we're not, launching free trade negotiations is not, shouldn't discourage anyone, because we have plenty to do that we can do right now, notwithstanding Mercosur. Trade facilitation is extremely important. These economic reforms they're talking about are extremely important. And the devil is in the details, and there's a lot of detailed work that's happening now and that needs to be done.
Yes. I see that we have a lot of challenges in the foreign trade, but we have high expectations. And since we moved the office last year, we have here in Brazil an expectation to get close to the US and make the free trade agreements and make things happen. Now we have the coronavirus problem, and I would like to share my condolences for all the people in US and in Brazil who lost their beloved ones. That's very important because we are having this pandemic time with so many problems. But I do believe that we're going to overcome these challenges, and I hope we have a good future. So, and I'd like to thank you, all of you, for coming for our webinar. It's very important to us to try to talk about a very important topic as foreign trade is. And I'd like to thank you, all the people who are watching this webinar in the US and in Brazil, people in Brasilia, Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, in America, people who support us in Florida, Georgia, New York, and California. It's an honor to have all of you here. So on behalf of Machado Goga Advogados and Torreão Braz Advogados, I'd like to thank you for your time. And I don't know if Renan wants to talk, make his considerations.
Just want to join you and once again thank all of our panelists and for partnering with us, and it's been an honor to have you with us. Thanks to all of our guest listeners, many friends and lawyers, entrepreneurs, and people that were dedicating this time to follow us and understand a little bit more about Brazil. So thank you, it's been an honor, and may we have other initiatives such as this one in the future.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.